Welcome. Thank you for watching another episode of Talking Truth. We are thinking this session about a subject that, obviously, as the younger of the group here, is a long way down the road for me, but we're going to speak about retirement. Is retirement something that is a biblical concept? Obviously, in the world, it's a huge thing, and everything is kind of geared up towards that day when you throw in the towel and stop working and retire. But is it something that we come across in the Bible? I was kind of brought to my attention recently, speaking to someone on the phone, and they asked me, so what's your plan for retirement? And I didn't really know how to answer that thing. So retirement, is it something that we think is found in the Bible? Is it a concept or a truth that's found in the Bible? Or should we, as Christians, stop our work and not do anything else and hang up the towel and just relax? What's your thoughts on retirement, Alistair?
Well, I think that the Bible definitely speaks about different stages of life or seasons of life. And if you take an Old Testament example of the priests, they were to serve from the ages of 25 to 50. And that was prescribed by in the law in Numbers 8. So there's obviously, God intends for our service to change depending on what kind of season of life we're in. The glory of the young man is his strength. And I take it that's one of the reasons why the priests were to retire at 50. Not that they stopped serving, but their sphere of service changed.
I think it was to assist their brothers, to work alongside them.
Yes. Yeah.
I think retirement is obviously more in the headlines and in our minds in our country now and in Western Europe in recent times, because some countries now people just have to keep on working because there is no pension pot, there is no welfare plan or anything for them. So it's a very relevant subject. I looked up the dictionary, retirement, because we don't really see that word in the Bible. It says this: the point at which someone stops working. Or another one, the action or fact of leaving one's job and ceasing to work. Now, for the Christian, of course, stopping working, ceasing to work is not anything we're ever called to do in that absolute sense, because as long as we're upon the earth and with all the strength and the resources that God gives us, we are called to serve and to work. So I particularly don't like the word retirement. I think language is important. Language is important, and words transmit ideas, and ideas can be formed thus formed through the words that we use. So I think I'd like to see it abandoned in Christian language, to be honest, the word retirement. We leave one sphere of work and maybe move to another sphere, whether that be paid or unpaid. Whatever that might be, it might be something a bit more involved with our church or whatever, but whatever we're doing, we're all working for the Lord all the time, no matter whether we're paid or unpaid, no matter what age we are, and He can change that sphere of work as He deems. And so the idea of ceasing to work is unbiblical with that. We're going to get onto the idea of, when we're older, we don't have the same energies, perhaps, and like that. We'll think about that, I'm sure. But yeah.
Yeah, I think with the priests or the Levites in the Old Testament, it was very much a physical point, wasn't it? It was a lot of the work they did was physical, carrying the items of the tabernacle, for example. So there was a practical reason why, from that particular sphere of service, there needed to be a retirement. And there may be things that we do in God's work that we get to a point, and we're probably coming on to this, we get to a point where we're not physically able to do them. And so there'll be something different God will have in mind for us.
I think I agree. And with regard to retirement, certainly we look forward to perhaps of that day when we cease from secular employment, but we should never retire from the things of the Lord. I think it's a very dangerous thing, spiritually speaking, in terms of, to retire to play golf, to travel the world. It's not helpful in terms of our endurance, in terms of our testimony to others, in terms of our steadfastness. I think we've always got to be active, because the old man continually rises up. And John Owen said something very powerful, I think, on the mortification of sin. We must be killing it, or it will be killing you. So we can never retire from the things of the Lord. We should always be pressing on.
There's a really, I think, and it still stands out as a really good sermon to watch, and it was when John Piper spoke in, I think it was the year 2000, to this 40,000 students, and he talked about the tragedy of, was it Bob and Penny, who took early retirement to gather seashells. And he says, that's the tragedy, our wasted opportunity. And he is warning these young people about going in for things, and that this is what our culture kind of aspires to. It's just a waste of time.
And that is true now of sort of our country as well. He called that, that's the American dream in a sense, you know. And what's presented in our country and in many countries is this idea to have enough so then you can retire and live life. You can really enjoy life then. And it's quite self-serving as well. You can do all the nothing wrong going on holidays, nothing wrong with having a hobby, but that's the ultimate, you know, because now it's all for you. And that's absolutely wrong.
And the thing was that he contrasted Bob and Penny with these others who had given their life in service for God and who had died in it. And people were looking, well, that's a tragedy. And he says, no, the tragedy is of a wasted life. And that is something as Christians we need to be very mindful of.
And these people have developed spiritually. You know, they've been transformed from one glory into another. These young men have been, you know, that maturing process, spiritually speaking, and so you're more useful. Although your physical capabilities are diminished, understand that, but spiritually speaking, we become more useful, and so we've got to be a good steward of all of these things.
Absolutely.
Just as we are to, if we engage in secular employment, we are to do our work to the glory of God. So we're to do everything to the glory of God. And so the day that secular work comes to an end doesn't mean we stop living for the glory of God. And therefore we don't retire from living for the glory of God. We only retire from that particular aspect of it.
And that's one of the points I was wanting to speak about, was in church life as well, there's no such thing as retirement. They may be moving on to serve the Lord in a different way. It may be. I love what Psalm 71 says. Now also when I'm old and grey-headed, O God, do not forsake me until I declare your strength to this generation. So they realise that they've moved on to that stage in life, the psalmist, but there's still something for him to do. And I think that's something perhaps we need to speak about in our churches more often, that there is a role and a work for every single generation.
Should definitely encourage that, and not let the mindset of those who are coming up to age, where it might be this leaving secular work, for want of a better phrase, in something else. This is now what you can think of. And in our country, in the countries we live in, you know, some people are able and in good health, some are in good health and able, don't need financial assistance then, and can serve in many different ways. You know, there's a huge opportunity there for people. You don't need to sit in garden centres and coffee shops 5 days a week. You can do it 1 day a week if you want. But there's lots
of tracks out when you're there.
Yeah, exactly. Whatever it might be, you know. I was thinking of Caleb, you know, in Joshua 14. You know, he's 80 years old. Yeah, I'm strong this day, as on the day that Moses sent me. You know, give me this place. You know, he didn't say I'm feet up for myself. You know, as the Lord enables.
And I think that if we think about Paul's final words in 2 Timothy, when he says, I have fought the fight, I have finished the course, and now, as he's facing death, that is his rest. And as the believer, our hope is that we do have a rest to look forward to, but it's when we enter heaven, it's not in this world.
There's a chap by the name of Richard Cecil, a friend and contemporary of John Newton, who was aged 80, or just prior to becoming 80, and his eyesight and hearing were failing. And Richard Cecil had the audacity to suggest that his friend John Newton would retire from the pulpit at age 80, and he replied, "What shall the old African blasphemer step aside while he can still speak?" And so, I mean, I think that's right. You know, if you could serve the Lord in this capacity, then go on.
Yeah, I always remember the strapline that John Blanchard, who many of us have preached his books, has gone to be with the Lord now. He had a strapline on his prayer letters: as much as I can, as well as I can, as long as I can. And I thought that's a great motto for every Christian to have in life. You know, the Lord knows what we're able to do. He knows our physical conditions. He's gifted us, but as much as I can, as well as I can, as long as I can. I thought that's a good thing for all of us to have.
There was a lady who I never met, but I just heard about her. She was an old lady in her 80s and she lived in Glasgow. And she would just basically fill her bag full of tracts, get on the bus and go down to Glasgow into the city and just give out tracts. And even in her 80s, that's what, because she was doing what she could as long as she could.
That's a wonderful little verse out of the scripture. You know, the Lord, when Mary, I take it as Mary, you know, broke the alabaster vase and put that perfume on the Lord's head and his feet, and he said she did what she could. And there's a marvelous little verse for people to think of. The Lord knows what you can do. You do what you can. You know.
Well, so I've retired. I know a long way off, maybe never. And so what could I do? So what could I do in my local church to help youth work, to help gospel work, to help parents?
Well, I think that it's also helpful to think about the fact that that when we think about the work of an overseer, we associate that with those who are spiritually mature, and sometimes we think of that as being an old man, whereas actually in the New Testament they were probably a lot younger than what we sometimes assume in our culture. But there probably also comes a point where the work is so demanding as an elder that there's maybe an idea where you are still looking to pass on wisdom, but maybe to step back a little bit from the kind of demanding work of being an overseer, if you've got the luxury of being able to pass the baton on to others. So when we think about work you can do as a retired person, the glory of the old man is the grey hairs, their wisdom. And that wisdom can be passed on in whatever way that they can.
I think practically as well, there's a lot of, you know, people who are in full-time paid employment, you know, can't visit people during the day. And so even that now is a great opportunity to visit those who are lonely, to visit those who had difficulties, and just be a help for them. So there's one real aspect, and to bring, you know, to speak spiritually with them in situations. Of course, there's something behind that. If you haven't really been serving the Lord for 30 odd years and built that set up, you're not all of a sudden going to change when you get to 65, whatever that age might be. You need to be serving then. But then there's greater opportunities, you know.
Yeah, I think you know, speaking perhaps a little bit from personal experience.
You retired, Graham?
Just about.
I thought it was just a big paper round.
Speaking from a little personal experience, I think there is the opportunity when giving up secular work, especially if you've been busy in the church as well as involved in secular work, there's an opportunity to spend more time with the Lord, to be less restricted in the time, if I can put it that way, in the time you spend in your quiet times with the Lord, which then should have a benefit for others as well, because it goes out from that. And I like Paul's point about opportunity to spend more time with people. I think another aspect, which Alistair kind of touched on as well, is that we should recognise that there are things that we won't be able to do so well as we get older. And I think that varies from person to person. That there are some men aged 90 whose minds are as clear as a bell and can still teach the Word of God, for example. But there are others who are only 70 who can't do it as well as they used to. And we need to recognise these things. And we don't all have wives as helpful as mine who are going to point out when I'm rubbish that's something I'm trying to do, and it's time I stopped. And we all could do with people who are honest with us like that.
I think it's also important for the younger people in the church to recognise the great blessing and resource older people are. So for example, William Wilberforce, a younger man, sought his good friend, but really his fatherly figure, John Newton, exhorted him to be his Moses-like figure as he fought with the Amalekites. And yet understand that, for an older person, what a blessing. I can actually be proactive in helping this really important work by prayer, by directed prayer. So I think it's important that as a church we articulate the fact we are blessed by these grey-haired wise people. And what a resource.
And it's interesting, I read an article recently where Gen Z were looking for that kind of authentic Christian life. And they said they want not so much the entertainment, but they wanted people that they could sit at the kitchen table with and speak about their spiritual experiences. And the article focused on this retired missionary couple who, having come back, that's what they were doing. They were pouring their life into the young people in their church and just taking time, having them in their home. And we should not undervalue the importance of that kind of a ministry.
Well, we've touched on it, I think, in a previous Talking Truth session, but Titus, so it's Paul to Titus, isn't it? It says the aged women should teach the younger women. Now, we live in a day when, for some married women, it's necessary for them to work for a while. But when an older woman is retired, therefore, there's an opportunity to spend time with younger women. And as we said before, is a two-way thing. The younger women need to be willing to be helped by the older women.
Yeah. I think there's also a practical point that, especially if you have younger couples in the assembly and there's new babies, then it's really helpful if you've got older sisters that can come alongside and say, look, we'll help clean or cook or take the baby for a little bit of time. Those kind of things are so invaluable, as I can remember as a parent.
So it really is, it's not the idea of retirement, it's the idea of just your activities move on.
Yeah.
You just go to the next level, the next stage, and there's always something to be involved in, there's always something to do, with the caveat though, if you want to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like
to
Solomon writes in Ecclesiastes, to everything there is a season, and seasons change under the Lord's providence.
We'll talk about seasons, our time has gone. Thankfully we've got a few questions that have been handed in to us, so we'll have a look at some of these questions now. So, got a few questions here. First of all, gents, how can we as a local church support retirees in our congregation? Is it appropriate to have ministry specifically for the older generations? Discuss.
Well, I think that there's definitely, when we think about people who are older, and Scripture does talk about widows specifically, that we have a responsibility to care for them, especially when they may not have the means to support. Now that support may not always be financial in our culture, but it might be. But just in terms of practically, and there's a whole issue of companionship. So the church really needs to think through strategically how they're going to support their widows, because it's a biblical mandate.
No, so I suppose we've assumed, everyone who retires has got finances to support themselves. They've left paid work or whatever. That might not be always the case. So I think there is financial support, but there is emotional support as well. People might be at home alone, not be able to do much. We're sort of thinking of people who are physically able. So there's that visitation and keeping in mind.
Yeah, there's visitation, support. But there's also perhaps the potential for having activities like coffee morning, etc., for not just for as an outreach, but for Christians to come together, the older Christians
actually,
to come together.
On a practical level, I know of a church that there was a whole bunch of ladies that had stopped working and stopped looking after grandchildren as well. So they set up a little knitting class, and they had that as an outreach as well. So there's things that you can have as from the church for the older people in the church to get involved in.
I was thinking in connection with that you're coming together for a coffee morning. A person who maybe doesn't feel able to preach a sermon could read a psalm for example, with the group, as just to have a spiritual element to it, as well as perhaps knitting or whatever else they're doing.
No, totally. So absolutely, there's definitely work that we can do as churches to pass on to people. Here's an interesting one though. Is it right or good for older men to step down when they're holding the work back?
Well, if they're holding the work back, and that's a definitive statement, the answer to that is definitively yes. There's no doubt about that, So there's a balance there, isn't there? And I suppose you look at each circumstance. There's probably some places where some men or women think, I'd love to hand this over. But unfortunately there's no one to hand it over to, or no one will. And then you can think of other opportunities, well, it'd be good if they handed it over or handed more over to other people, not hold on to things as well. So yeah, absolutely. I don't think it always should be by just the date on the birth certificate as well, just because there's a figure reached, whatever that might be.
But I sometimes think we need to be a little bit sensitive to it as well, by suggesting, well, maybe you're not fit to do that. However, there's something here that you could do instead, or that would work alongside or work in conjunction with.
Yeah, everything should be done sensitively, but I sometimes, I felt this for a long time, that in a sector, in a business situation, people are willing to be honest with one another about whether they can do a job or not. But in the church, often we can't be honest with one another, and that's a terrible thing.
We choose not to be honest.
We choose not to be. And it's a bad thing in both directions. It's a bad thing if I'm not prepared to take honesty from somebody else. But equally, I should be prepared to be honest with them.
And sometimes it can be that you're well able to do the job, but someone else would like to serve in some way, and you can see they'd like to. So have the humility maybe to just pass that on, and then with your wisdom, maturity, seek something else that you can do as well.
I think that in a healthy church, that there should always be the recognition that nobody's being discouraged from serving, but the sphere in which they're serving needs to maybe change and to be something more appropriate to their age and ability. And so shouldn't ever be a negative thing, it should be a positive, because they're doing something that they're more suited for. And as an assembly, we need to think through that.
I mean, the church is family, isn't it? In a very real sense. And within the family dynamic, sometimes, it's, if an elderly parent they get told to drive, it's a very difficult conversation to have. So it is very difficult. And equally that will be the case in a spiritual sense as well. So I mean, these things have got to be handled very carefully with prayer and with sensitivity. But I think also, as a church, to have that desire to pass the baton on to the next generation. So if we have that culture within the church, then that, I think, when these things come, it'll be a lot easier discussion to have.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think if there is that just normal culture, it's something that people have been used to. It's a lot easier when people it will be easier. It may not be easy.
Okay, well, thank you, gentlemen. I'm not sure what your plans are for retirement or soon, but there's plenty of work to do. And perhaps even watching this today, you're considering these things as a work for God for you to do, if you just seek it prayerfully and find it. So thank you for watching, and God bless.